They have fed some of their victims, dead and alive.
December 2019. The world watched as Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Lora, better known as El Chapo, was sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, his name echoes across Mexico and the United States, a reminder of the brutal empire he built. For years, he ruled the drug trade, evading authorities time and again, most famously after escaping from prison in 2001. With billions at his disposal, it seemed like no one could touch him, until two brothers, who El Chapo trusted like sons, turned the tide. The Flores twins. Rising swiftly in the underworld, these brothers not only earned El Chapo's favor, but also became the key to his downfall. But how did they gain El Chapo's trust? And what led them to betray the man who treated them like family? Born to Mexican immigrant parents in 1981, Pedro and Margarito Flores were known as Pete and Jay or Junior among their family and friends from an early age. The twin brothers were born 17 minutes apart and spent the first 14 years in a one-story home in an area known as Little Village among Chicagoans. The area was known for gang and drug violence. The Flores twins were quiet and polite in their childhood, a trait that would fool many when they entered the drug world in the later years of their lives. But they also had another trait that helped them stay off the authorities' radar for several years: intelligence. The twin brothers were extremely intelligent and were exposed to narcotics dealings from a very young age. While their parents were factory workers, only their mother returned home from work in the evening. By day, their father, Margarito Flores, drove a forklift at a local candy factory. But as soon as the sun set, he turned into a narco trafficker. Pete and Jay were used by their father as a load cover to smuggle drugs from Mexico to the United States. They sat on top of multiple kilos of marijuana and other drugs, while their father drove the car back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico. Bringing his kids with him helped Margarito prevent suspicion while on the road. Since they were looking for their father from a very young age, the Flores twins became familiar with the ins and outs of the drug trade while still in their childhood. Although they had some close encounters with police, Pete and Jay stayed clear of serious trouble during their early years. In 1989, when the twins were just 8, one of them was caught hanging out with the members of the Latin Kings, the gang that controlled the drug distribution and ruled their neighborhood in Chicago. But the charges were dismissed. In the mid-1990s, their father moved back to Mexico, but the Flores twins didn't go with him to where their family had originally come from. Rather, they decided to stay in the United States and try their luck in something they had known and seen for as long as they could remember: drug trafficking. Pete and Jay used their father's contacts and formally entered the narco world. Their father had used the old methods to smuggle and distribute drugs, but the Flores twins weren't like their father in this regard. They were innovators. They came up with new and unconventional ideas to distribute drugs on the streets of Chicago. And these ideas soon started paying off handsomely. Before the twin brothers emerged on the scene, the cartels used gangs in the United States to get their products on the streets. Cities were divided among different gangs, like the Latin Kings, and each gang was responsible for guarding their territory, even if it meant spilling blood. The Flores twins didn't want to get involved in shooting bullets and taking bullets for their territory, so they devised a new strategy. They made alliances with different gangs regardless of their territory and did the wholesale business of drugs with buyers who were interested in the same thing as them: making money. From African Americans to Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, their clients included people of every color and background. This is why, just a few years into the drug business, the Flores twins became extremely successful, racking up millions of dollars in profits every month. By the early 2000s, the twin brothers had established a huge customer base and were buying as much as 10,000 kilos of cocaine per month. This is when they caught the eye of their biggest supplier, El Chapo Guzmán. While he had been involved in the drug trade for several years, El Chapo rose to prominence when he broke out of jail in 2001. After that, he became a mythical figure in Mexico. Like the Flores twins, El Chapo was also an innovator. He was known for being creative with ways to smuggle drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border and deliver them throughout the United States. From tunnels to homemade submarines, El Chapo had ways to transport hundreds of tons of drugs to the United States without getting noticed or caught. El Chapo was running the biggest and most dangerous Mexican drug ring, the Sinaloa Cartel, and was seen as untouchable in his home country. No one except a few honest politicians and law enforcement officers dared talk about him, let alone try to catch him. This was also because he had the police and the majority of decision-makers in his pockets. El Chapo's drug empire had grown to nearly $3 billion by 2004, but he wanted more, and the Flores twins were perfect for the expansion he envisioned. To make his dream a reality, El Chapo dealt directly with the Flores twins and was quickly impressed by their intelligence and approach to the business. They became his family and received the most favorable pricing structure the Sinaloa Cartel was willing to offer at the time. Chicago became the hub of El Chapo's drug trade in the United States for several reasons, such as being located at the heart of the United States and hosting a diverse community. But the biggest reason was the Flores twins, who, over the past few years, had established a sophisticated network of drugs in the city and across the country. El Chapo could easily hide his gang members among the large Mexican population in Chicago and run his operations in collaboration with the Flores twins. Soon, the teens were moving nearly $145 million worth of cocaine from Mexico and distributing it in the United States through their highly efficient and effective network. This saw Mexican drugs as far north as Canada, besides the major U.S. cities like Washington, New York, and Boston. In 2003, the Flores twins had flooded the streets of Chicago with drugs. El Chapo already knew how good the brothers were at drug distribution, so he summoned them to a meeting in Sinaloa. Opioids were slowly becoming popular in the United States. The Mexican cartels were quick to realize that they would make much more by selling heroin than cocaine. This is because they had to import cocaine from Colombia while they could produce their own heroin in Mexico without having to rely on the Colombians. Although the drug was deadlier than cocaine, the financial aspect was lucrative. The heroin cost the Mexican cartels just a few $100s per kilo, but its market price in a place like Chicago was $55,000 per kilo. The customer base was there to tap, and profits were off the chart. This saw the demand for opioids in the United States skyrocket by 2005, with people looking to get their hands on the drug that fulfilled their cravings like none other. But when they couldn't get their hands on cocaine, the next best thing on the street was heroin. And as soon as the new drug hit the U.S. market, law enforcement agencies began noticing the changes. Jack Riley, a U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency official at the time, described it this way: "We began seeing tremendous amounts of high-grade, cheap heroin hit the streets. So we really began to see the heroin use go up, overdoses go up, a different population using heroin. Virtually every walk of life, every social, economic level, from the affluent white suburbs to the inner city. We began seeing high school-age kids using heroin, overdosing, and all of the things that are associated with narcotic trafficking. Violent crime, shooting. There were 19 homicides in one weekend, almost 200 shootings. And all of that, in my mind, was narcotic-related, and Chapo was calling the shots, sitting on his mountain in Sinaloa. And he didn't care. He didn't care who died. El Chapo was sitting in Sinaloa, where he was beyond the reach of American federal authorities. However, his main distributors were in Chicago, carefully managing drug operations to avoid getting noticed by the Drug Enforcement Agency. By 2005, the Flores twins had become the biggest drug traffickers in Chicago's history. But the level at which they were operating was prone to weak links, and that's exactly what happened in 2005. During a raid, the authorities busted one of the twin brothers' wholesale customers, and after a few rounds of interrogation, he gave them up. The authorities quickly moved against Peter and Jay, indicted them on felony drug charges, and issued a federal warrant for their arrest. The Flores twins knew staying in the United States was dangerous, and they could end up spending decades in jail. So, to avoid their biggest nightmare, they decided to move to their ancestral land, Mexico. In the summer of 2005, Peter and Jay moved to Guadalajara along with their wives. While their families thought this would be the end of their drug distribution career, it was actually the beginning of something far more serious and bigger for the Flores brothers. Since they were now in Mexico, the twin brothers worked closely with El Chapo and his cartel partners. What had made the twins so successful at such a young age was their strong bond with each other and a clear distinction of responsibilities according to their skill set. While in Mexico, Jay Flores was responsible for negotiating contracts with Sinaloa Cartel and its partner organizations, and then getting the agreed-upon shipments of drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border. Once the drugs crossed the border and reached their destinations in the United States, it was then Peter's responsibility to handle their distribution. They had as many as 200 people working for them in different cities across the United States who took care of selling drugs to customers and collecting cash. The business had grown even more since the Flores twins had moved to Mexico, and it showed in their lavish lifestyle. From luxury condos to the latest sports cars and ranch full of exotic animals, the brothers were living a dream life. But bigger operations and a more successful business also meant attracting bigger problems. After a few months of living in Mexico, one of the Mexican federal police officers recognized Peter Flores as a wanted American fugitive. Knowing that the brothers are in hiding in Mexico, he demands a huge amount of bribes in exchange for not arresting them and handing them to the relevant authorities for their extradition to the U.S. The Flores brothers refused to fulfill the officer's demand for a bribe to stay in the country. As a result, they and their wives were kidnapped from a club at gunpoint. The next thing they knew, they were in a police station in front of the same officer. But the twin brothers weren't some ordinary drug distributors whom the Sinaloa Cartel and El Chapo could afford to lose. They were their biggest money-making machine. And El Chapo made sure they were safe while in Mexico. The police officer let them go when El Chapo himself called him and told him about the consequences if he initiated any legal proceedings against the Flores brothers. The twins were set free because no one wanted to mess with El Chapo Guzmán. But this problem was nothing compared to what was about to come. By 2008, the Flores twins had become too valuable for the Mexican drug lords. And when the fight broke out between the Sinaloa Cartel and Beltran-Leyva organization, Peter and Jay were faced with the toughest decision of their lives up until that point: choose whose side they were on. Both the cartels knew the success of their business depended on the Flores brothers, so they wanted them on their side. But the drug lords were also clear that they couldn't let the other party have the Flores twins, so they were willing to kill the brothers in case they didn't choose to be on their side. The Flores twins, on the other hand, wanted to stay clear of any trouble, as they always had ever since they entered the drug business. All of a sudden, Guadalajara had become a bloodbath, and the Flores twins were caught in the middle of it. Although they told both sides that they didn't want to choose as this wasn't their war to fight, they didn't have the luxury to do so. Now there was only one way left for the Flores twins to avoid getting killed by the cartels in Mexico: go back to the United States. Although the twins were desperate to go back to the United States to save their and their families' lives, they knew they would be arrested the moment they landed on U.S. soil. So they made another intelligent move to save themselves. They made a deal with American law enforcement. In October 2008, lawyers of the Flores twins reached out to the DEA and the United States Attorney's Office and asked them to show leniency towards the brothers in exchange for valuable information that could help gather solid proof against El Chapo Guzmán and lead to his arrest. The U.S. authorities agreed, and the team started giving details about the Sinaloa Cartel's operations in the United States. Soon after they signed the deal, an undercover agent took control of 2 of the drug shipments from Mexico. The Flores brothers pretended to have a problem with the quality of one of the shipments to get a chance to talk to El Chapo directly, and they did get the chance.
Amigo, ¿Qué dice, oiga? ¿Cómo está?
Bien, bien, ¿cómo estás tu carnal?
Todos bien, oiga, aquí.
Peter asked El Chapo for a discount on the shipment that was low quality.
¿Usted cree que lo podemos arreglar? ¿Me puede rebajar unos 5 pesos de esos?
¿A cómo tratamos?
Me lo está dando a 55.
Ay, ¿a cómo me van a pagar?
Yo le dije, oiga, si me hace el favor se los pago 50, pero ahí tengo el cheque listo.
El Chapo was ruthless to the world, but he had a soft spot for the Flores brothers because of how much they had helped him expand in the United States.
Bueno, entonces mañana recojo el dinero, ¿está bien?
It was the first time ever that the U.S. government had the most credible and undisputed evidence against one of the biggest drug lords in the world. El Chapo was extremely careful who he talked to and what he shared with them. But he trusted the Flores twins so much that he didn't imagine in his wildest dreams to be betrayed by them one day. That is the reason why the twin brothers were able to secretly get El Chapo admitted to his drug business. In November 2008, after giving valuable information and recorded calls with El Chapo, the Flores twins surrendered to the DEA in Guadalajara. When the news of their cooperation reached their father, he didn't believe it and called them cowards for deciding to quit the drug distribution business. Despite being critical of the path his sons had chosen for themselves, the father was kidnapped just as the Flores twins landed in the United States. The note on his car was a clear indication that the Sinaloa Cartel knew about what the Flores twins had been up to. It read, "Tell those two dumbers to stop talking, or we will send you his head." The father disappeared, and it was assumed that he had been murdered. As soon as the Flores twins arrived in the United States, a detailed interrogation started in Chicago. They told the authorities everything about the Sinaloa Cartel and their own distribution business in the United States. Sinaloa Cartel mainly used to smuggle drugs into the United States through the hidden compartments in cargo trailers. The drugs would then be unloaded from trailers and go to the Flores twins, who had a vast network of houses, warehouses, and safe houses spread throughout Chicago and its suburbs. They rented homes in upper-class neighborhoods of Chicago to avoid raising any suspicion. In those apartments and houses, the drug money was counted without having to worry about the police. When the drugs were sold and money was counted, the next task was to send it to Mexico, and it normally followed the same route and shipping method as the drugs. The Flores twins had become so good at their job that, according to the U.S. government, Peter and Jay Flores moved $1.8 billion from the United States to Mexico just during the time they were dealing with El Chapo Guzmán. Following the concrete proof against El Chapo in the form of recordings, cases were filed in as many as 7 U.S. courts in different cities, including Chicago. While the U.S. and Mexican authorities were in the hunt for El Chapo Guzmán, the Flores twins' case concluded. In normal circumstances, anyone with the crime that the twin brothers had committed would have received lifetime imprisonment. But their smart move to cooperate with the U.S. authorities helped them in their legal battle, and the Flores twins were sentenced to 14 years in prison. One of the major points in their deal with the U.S. authorities was that the Flores twins would testify against El Chapo when he was captured, but getting their hands on the infamous drug lord was the toughest job the law enforcement agencies had to do in a long time. The authorities were on a constant hunt for El Chapo in the mountains of Sinaloa, but he was a Mexican Robin Hood. He was adored among common people. Kids idealized him and wanted to either be like him or work for him when they grew up. Ever since his breakout from prison in 2001, the drug lord had been living in the mountains of Sinaloa, where reaching him would be impossible, if not extremely difficult. People living in the Sinaloa mountains didn't have enough opportunities to feed themselves and their kids, so mostly people opted to work in the poppy fields and make ends meet. El Chapo was less an employer and more of an owner of everybody living in his area. This is why he was always a step ahead of the authorities, and several manhunt missions failed between 2001 and 2014. Mexican cartels used an encrypted communication system and BlackBerry phones to exchange information with each other and make deals. They thought their digital system of communication was safe and often let their guard down during conversations. Little did they know that the authorities could hack the system to get to them. This is exactly what happened to El Chapo. On 22 February 2014, the Mexican authorities received a signal from El Chapo Guzmán's phone from a condo building in Sinaloa. Mexican authorities sent in their elite force, the Mexican Marines, to storm the building and arrest El Chapo. When the soldiers broke open his door, El Chapo ran to the bathroom first, but then silently surrendered. El Chapo was taken to Mexico's maximum security prison while he awaited trial. But considering his track record, the U.S. authorities sensed it would be too difficult to keep him incarcerated in Mexico for long. And that's exactly what happened. A little over a year after he was arrested, El Chapo escaped from the Federal Social Readaptation Center No. He escaped through a tunnel that opened in his shower area at one end and into a house construction site 1.5 kilometers away from the prison at the other end. It wasn't a usual incident. Considering his previous escape, it was expected that he would be subject to greater monitoring. However, him fooling everyone and running the way he did shocked everyone. His escape in 2015 also showed the level of connections he had in the Mexican government, and he was untouchable as long as he was in Mexico. This embarrassed the Mexican authorities and the government, and they began searching for him even more carefully. 6 months following his escape in 2014, the authorities once again pinpointed a location where they thought they would find El Chapo. The infamous drug lord once again escaped through a tunnel when the place he was staying at was raided by the Mexican Marines. He carjacked a vehicle to run away from the authorities, but the car soon broke down, and authorities caught up to him. This time, Mexican authorities didn't want to take any chances, so they expedited the process for his extradition. The reason was simple. The corruption in Mexico was so deep-rooted that the decision-makers knew keeping him in a Mexican prison for long would be impossible. On January 19, 2017, El Chapo was extradited to the United States and his trial began in November 2018. The prosecution prepared a detailed case against him in which he was accused of some of the serious crimes, like drug trafficking, conspiracy to murder, kidnappings, and whatnot. However, Guzmán's lawyers argued that he wasn't the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel and had stopped all his drug-related activities in 1985. The case seemed to be hanging in the balance when the prosecution brought out 14 cooperating witnesses against Guzmán, and 2 of those witnesses are the Flores brothers. El Chapo wasn't surprised at knowing other people had turned against him as much as he was surprised to see the Flores twins as witnesses against him, because he could never imagine the brothers turning against him. But just when he was wrapping his head around the fact that the 2 boys he once considered his sons had turned against him, the recording of the phone call between Peter and El Chapo was also played in the court. On February 12, 2019, the jury sided with the prosecution and handed El Chapo a life in prison plus 30 years. And just a year after that, in December 2020, Peter and Jay Flores were released from prison after serving 12 out of their 14 years jail time, marking an end to their story as the twins who helped put El Chapo behind bars after making billions for him.